A swirl of icy wind cut across the snowy expanse of the North Pole, carrying the smell of peppermint and warm cookies even through the bitter cold. Pops exhaled a misty breath and pulled his heavy fur-lined coat tighter around his body. Not far behind, Olive stood with one hand shielding her eyes from the sun's reflection off the crystal white snow. Clinging to Pop's shoulder was the legendary Wiffle hen, letting out faint coos that echoed across the tundra. Though it was midday, the perpetual winter sky hung with an almost twilight hue. Everything felt otherworldly in this place, as though magic itself hummed in the air, fueled by the spirit of Christmas. And if all went according to plan, Christmas would be saved, and perhaps something even more precious would be won. But as with most journeys involving these two, simply arriving at their destination was only the start of the adventure. Pops and Olive were far from the seafaring islands they usually traveled between as part of the Sailing Adventurers Guild. This time, their mission wasn't about lost treasure or capturing sea monsters. Instead, they had come at Santa's personal behest. One of Santa's reindeer, Blitzer, had been gravely injured the morning of Christmas Eve, and Santa knew that if that reindeer wasn't healed before the night was out, there would be a whole world of disappointed children. The gift delivery simply could not be delayed. And so, Olive, the traveling veterinarian with a specialty in magical creatures, had been asked to do what she did best. Pops understood how much this meant to Olive. He was no veterinarian, but he was a fighter, a brawler who'd tackled everything from sea serpents to necromantic krakens. If anyone dared to stand in their way, well, he'd handle that. And maybe, if luck was kind, they could squeeze in time for a more personal pursuit, a special gift for Olive, something that would show just how much she meant to him. But then again, the North Pole was rarely a place for quiet or simple tasks. A swirling, cosmic energy seemed to emanate from Santa's workshop, drawing not only well-meaning travelers like them but also those with more sinister intentions. Unbeknownst to Pops, Olive, or even Santa himself, there were other visitors converging on the North Pole that very night. Hagatha, the last witch on Earth, arrived in the swirling snow flurries on a sleigh pulled by monstrous wolves, each with glowing red eyes. Her black robes trailed behind her, and she cackled to herself as the pack approached the magical barrier that separated the workshop grounds from the Arctic wilderness. She had come for the elves, or more accurately, to control them. If she could command Santa's industrious little helpers, she could force them to create an unstoppable device, one that would rid her of her rival, Olive, once and for all. In Hagatha's eyes, Pops was her future husband, the most handsome man in the world, and she would do anything to remove Olive from the equation. Meanwhile, patrolling the perimeter was Professor Van Helsing, clad in thick hunter's attire, crossbow slung over his shoulder. He was on special guard duty this year. Santa employed him and other monster hunters from the World Monster Hunter Guild to protect against Christmas-hating fiends that lurked around the holiday season. Krampus was the most notorious among them, but there were countless others. When Van Helsing caught the slightest movement in the swirling snow, he crouched, gripping the hilt of a silver dagger. He knew one of his biggest targets, Hagatha, the last witch, might show up. If she did, he intended to settle their age-old rivalry once and for all, maybe even before Santa took off in his sleigh. And then there was Feathermaster. This self-proclaimed tyrant lord, wearing a crown of rare and powerful feathers, believed that divinity could be seized by harnessing the power of magical birds. The legendary Wiffle hen, perched on Pop's shoulder, was the ultimate prize among birds. But Feathermaster's ambition tonight reached beyond mere feathers. He coveted Santa's magical eyes that could see every child around the world, that gleaned who was naughty or nice. If Feathermaster could tear out one of those eyes and implant it into his own skull, the cult he led would have undeniable proof of his godhood. And then, the entire planet would have to bow before his divine vision. Each of these extraordinary individuals had crossed paths before. They had clashed in volcanic caverns, atop ocean galleons, and in hidden forests full of monstrous creatures. But now, fate had drawn them all to the same location on the same night. Christmas Eve at the North Pole was about to become ground zero for a grand conflict that could determine the fate of the holiday, and perhaps, the fate of each of their heart's desires. Pops tapped his gloved hands against his sides. "Olive, you're sure Blitzer's wound is something you can handle?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Olive, though chilled, grinned. She had a determined sparkle in her emerald eyes. "I've studied every reindeer remedy in the magical bestiary. With a little help, we'll have him fit for flight again." She brushed snowflakes from her dark hair, trying not to let the cold hamper her natural confidence. Pop smiled in return. "That's my girl." He gently rubbed the feathers of the Wiffle hen. "We'll get it done, or my name isn't." Boom! An echoing roar thundered across the Arctic plain. In an instant, Professor Van Helsing, on the outer ramparts of Santa's village, leapt into high alert. Beyond him, monstrous shapes were prowling in the snowdrifts, Krampus and his misfit minions, no doubt drawn to the warmth and magical presence of the workshop. Van Helsing unsheathed a flintlock pistol from his coat and fired into the sky, letting out a loud yell, "Barrier reinforcement." The shot exploded into a shimmering crest of light that expanded like a dome over the village. He'd obviously found himself in the middle of a skirmish, but before he could gauge how many threats were out there, he heard a voice he had dreaded for years. "Van Helsing," came a sly, mocking tone from behind. "I've waited so long to see that face of yours again." Van Helsing whirled around to see Hagatha perched on the back of her largest wolf, riding dangerously close to the boundary. "Witch," he spat, "I swore I'd rid the earth of your kind." Hagatha smirked. "Oh, you and your silly family tradition. Doesn't it ever tire you?" She didn't wait for an answer. Instead, she raised her crooked staff. "Monster brew conjure." Her staff crackled with eerie green lightning, summoning half a dozen scaled beasts that resembled alligators crossed with polar bears. The creatures rumbled forward, slamming themselves against the magical barrier. The translucent field sparked on impact, but cracks of light began to spiderweb across it. Van Helsing gritted his teeth. "You'll not breach this perimeter, witch." He whirled his crossbow forward in a graceful motion. Arrow of St. Nicholas. A bolt of glowing silver erupted from the crossbow, streaking across the snow in a brilliant flash before striking one of the monstrous alligator-bear hybrids. It disintegrated on contact, a swirl of green mist indicating that it had indeed been conjured by Hagatha's dark magic. But 5 more beasts still pounded at the barrier, and each strike weakened the protective shield a little more. Meanwhile, deeper within the protective field, Santa's workshop bustled with frantic elves. Gifts were piled in towers, halfway loaded into a great red sleigh. Santa himself paced near the stable where the reindeer were kept. Blitzer lay on a cushioned bed of hay, an ominous black bruise visible just above his front hoof. Pops and Olive arrived at the stable door, both taking off their snowy boots before stepping inside. The warmth hit them like a hug. The reindeer inside eyed them curiously. But Santa's concern melted into relief at the sight of Olive. He'd heard stories of her skill. "Ho, ho! Thank you for coming, my friends," Santa said, his voice losing none of its jolly timbre despite the situation. "Blitzer is in rough shape." Olive wasted no time. She knelt beside the injured reindeer, gently pressing her ear to his chest to hear his heartbeat, then checked the wound swelling. "It's a magical burn," she murmured. "Something caused a magical backlash. Possibly from entering an unstable dimensional portal, or from a cursed object. But don't worry, I have just the thing." At her belt she carried a series of small pouches filled with salves and potions. She produced a glowing violet ointment. "Conifer cure-all," she said. "I'll need to apply this while performing the reindeer's lullaby call." Pop stepped forward, face set. "You can do it, Olive," he assured her. He couldn't help but stare at her in admiration. In his eyes, she was even more radiant under stress, courageous, focused, and caring. Santa let out a soft ho, ho, calmer now. "If you can heal Blitzer, Christmas can still happen." But just as Olive prepared to apply the ointment, an explosion rocked the stable. Splinters of wood rained down, and the reindeer scattered in alarm. Pop stood in front of Olive protectively, raising his forearms to block debris. A monstrous roar rattled the stable walls. Through the new gaping hole stepped something large, covered in coarse black fur, with curling horns and a grinning, fanged face. Krampus. Santa's eyes widened with dismay. "That beast. He's broken through the perimeter." Krampus snarled, flexing razor-like claws. 2 smaller goat-like creatures scurried at his feet, cackling wickedly. Pops clenched his fists. Time to show this holiday fiend he'd messed with the wrong couple. "Olive," Pops said, voice low, "get Blitzer somewhere safe. I'll handle this." She nodded, taking the reindeer's reins. But before she could go far, Krampus lunged, claws outstretched. The wiffle hen let out a panicked squawk and fluttered off Pop's shoulder. Pops roared, drawing back his fist. Winter whirlwind punch. A spiraling mass of snow and wind surrounded Pop's fist, courtesy of the wiffle hen's spontaneously activated magic. He lunged upward, smashing Krampus' jaw, sending the creature careening backward into a stack of feed barrels. The impact shook the stable, but Krampus recovered quickly, baring his teeth in fury. Outside, the thunder of monstrous footsteps continued. Hagatha's conjured beasts had broken the barrier in multiple places now. And as Van Helsing struggled to reassert control, he heard footsteps crunching on the snow behind him. Pivoting swiftly, he came face to face with none other than Feathermaster himself, resplendent in a robe of vibrant plumage, his crown of feathers glittering with arcane power. Several hooded cultists flanked him, each wearing a lesser, but still unnerving, feather headdress. Van Helsing's nose wrinkled in disgust. "You again," he growled. "You're not here by coincidence." "Indeed not," Feathermaster replied, voice supremely confident. "My sources indicate that Santa's ocular power is beyond measure. I intend to seize it for the good of the earth. And for my rightful place as a god." His gaze flicked beyond Van Helsing, to the glimpses of movement near Santa's stable. "Of course, I also see that the legendary Wiffle Hen is nearby. One more prize for the taking." Van Helsing raised his crossbow, yet found himself uncertain of which threat to prioritize, Hagatha's monsters or this megalomaniac with a cult. In the spirit of Christmas, Van Helsing said dryly, "I'd advise you to leave. But you never do take advice, do you?" Feathermaster smirked. "I am done with words, Hunter. It's time for action. Divine Feather Storm." He lifted his arms, and the feathers adorning his headdress glowed with bright neon colors. A vortex of razor-sharp quills radiated outward like a tornado of blades. Van Helsing dove behind a snowbank, but not before a volley of feathers ripped into the air overhead, showering the area with 1,000 cuts of energy. Some of the conjured beasts recoiled from the onslaught. Hagatha, observing from a short distance, scowled as her monsters were caught in the crossfire. She screeched, "Feathermaster, you pompous buffoon! You're ruining my plan." From atop her wolf, she raised her staff once more. "Winterworm call." A swirl of black clouds formed overhead, and a single enormous serpent-like creature, formed from ice and writhing shadows, dove from the sky. It opened an impossibly wide mouth, filled with icicle teeth, and lunged at Feathermaster and his cultists. Feathermaster's cultists acted swiftly, huddling into a tight formation. Each chanted an incantation that imbued Feathermaster's wings with a golden glow, allowing him to hover several feet in the air. With a gesture, he unleashed another volley of glowing feathers at the descending ice worm. From the chaos of the battlefield, one could see that the entire North Pole was under siege. At the outer edges, elves with candy cane spears tried valiantly to fend off small goblin-like creatures that had slipped through the cracks of the magical barrier. Van Helsing was caught between fighting Hagatha's monstrous forces and stopping Feathermaster's unholy pursuit. And deeper inside the stables, Pops now faced Krampus alone while Olive attempted to rescue Blitzer. Pops and Krampus circled each other, exchanging savage blows. Every time Krampus swung, Pops answered with a clenched fist or a well-timed block, his typical brawler style in full display. It looked like a brutal boxing match set against a holiday backdrop. Krampus leapt, raking downward with elongated claws. Pops ducked and bellowed, North Star uppercut. Light streaked up from the ground around his fist as he smashed Krampus under the chin. The monstrous creature toppled back into the stable wall again, splintering yet more wood. Olive guided Blitzer through the cluttered workshop. In an adjacent stable stall, she began to apply the conifer cure-all, her palm gently pressed to Blitzer's flank. In a soothing voice, she sang a lilting call, a lullaby in a language known only to reindeer. The reindeer's labored breathing began to slow, and the black bruise around his hoof started to shrink. Outside, Santa paced, torn between helping defend the workshop and staying to make sure his reindeer were safe. He placed a kindly hand on Olive's shoulder, giving her a thankful nod for her skill. Meanwhile, as if the night couldn't become more hectic, Hagatha burst through the partially destroyed stable doorway, cackling at the top of her lungs. She had dismissed her monstrous wolves after they'd carried her here. Now, she was flying on a giant broom-like staff, trailing green sparks. Seeing Olive, she gave a sneer. "So this is where you've scurried off to?" Olive's heart jolted. She positioned herself between Blitzer and Hagatha, well aware of the witch's intentions. "I don't have time for your nonsense, Hagatha," Olive said with more confidence than she felt. She gently continued to rub the ointment on Blitzer, refusing to let the witch's presence rattle her. Hagatha laughed wickedly. "Nonsense? This is all quite important, dear. If I remove you from the picture, then Pops can finally be mine." She locked eyes with Olive, raising her staff. Frost-fanged familiar. In response, the air beside Hagatha shimmered, a swirling distortion forming. From it emerged a giant wolf with crystalline fangs, eyes burning with a malevolent yellow glow. It snarled, padding closer to Olive. Olive's heart pounded, but she refused to abandon Blitzer. She slowed her breathing. She had learned various bestial calls, although she wasn't sure if the wolf would respond. Still, she had to try. Quietly, Olive let out a series of low, guttural calls. It was a wolf communication pattern indicating submission and peace, a gamble to calm the summoned beast enough to finish healing the reindeer. The wolf paused, tilting its head. For just a fraction of a second, it seemed confused. Hagatha's brow furrowed. "No, you fool beast!" she shrieked, raising her staff again. "Obey me." The moment of calm was lost. The wolf lunged forward, teeth bared. Olive braced herself, but just then, the door burst open for a second time. Pops slid in on a patch of ice, fists raised. "You won't lay a finger on my girlfriend." Hagatha's face lit up with a twisted grin. "Oh, my dear Pops, you're just in time. I was about to rid us of that meddling veterinarian." She locked eyes with him, letting out a theatrical sigh. "Then you and I can finally be together." Pops tensed. He wanted to rush her, but the wolf was an immediate threat. He clenched his fists and shouted, "Polar pummel." A white aura of swirling snow enveloped his fists. He charged the wolf, exchanging blow after blow with the spectral creature. Each of his punches emitted a blast of frost that crackled against the wolf's ghost-like hide. The beast howled, staggering back with each strike. Hagatha glowered. "Persistent brute," she hissed. "I'd almost admire it if it weren't directed at protecting her." She brandished her staff once more. Glacial shackles. The air shimmered again, forming ghostly chains of ice that shot toward Pops. He felt them wrap around his torso, yanking him off balance. The wolf seized the opportunity to leap, jaws parted wide. Pops roared, muscles straining to break free. At that very moment, the wiffle hen fluttered in from above, landing on his shoulder and letting out a loud, magical cluck. Instantly, Pops felt a surge of heat, a new random magic bestowed by the wiffle hen. Flames flickered around his body, melting the glacial chains. As the wolf descended, Pops launched a burning fist straight into its maw. Flaming comet punch. The wolf exploded into a mist of dying embers and ice shards. Freed from the chains, Pops rolled onto the stable floor, panting. Hagatha's eyes went wide, but fury quickly replaced her shock. That accursed bird again. She glared at the wiffle hen, perched on Pop's shoulder, ruffling its feathers as if proud of its heroic deed. Across the village, the swirl of chaos was no less intense. Feathermaster, still locked in a standoff with Van Helsing, soared overhead while his cultists formed geometric patterns in the snow, chanting spells to draw more power from their headdresses. Hagatha's ice worm circled around, diving at them. Van Helsing took advantage of the distraction. If the worm was attacking Feathermaster's group, that was one threat off his back. At least temporarily. He had a bigger responsibility, ensuring Santa's workshop was safe. He sprinted across the snow, reloading his crossbow on the move. The sound of cackling goblins hammered at his senses. Several small creatures slithered in from the perimeter breach, brandishing candy canes sharpened into spears. Van Helsing skidded to a halt, raising the crossbow. Holly bolt. A spiral of red and green energy flew from the crossbow, striking one goblin right between the eyes, sending it tumbling into the snow with a yelp. The others squealed and scrambled away, frightened by the distinctive holy energy that emanated from Van Helsing's ammunition. "No time to waste," he muttered. He scowled at the swirling battles around him. Krampus was nowhere to be seen, likely deeper in the workshop. And that was an even greater concern. If Krampus got hold of any of Santa's magical relics, who knew what might happen? A sudden hush fell across the courtyard as an unexpected arrival emerged from the swirling snow. It was Santa himself, stepping outside the stable. His jolly face was serious, and he held a large, ornate staff set with a shimmering star at the top. Elves who had been panicking moments before now rallied around him, emboldened by his presence. There was something undeniably comforting about Santa, even amidst chaos. Santa lifted his staff, and a wave of warm, golden light emanated from it. In that moment, battered parts of the workshop began to mend, wooden planks piecing themselves back together. The broken hole in the stable began to close with a wreath of sparkling energy. Some of the lesser monsters summoned by Hagatha disintegrated or fled, pained by the aura of pure Christmas spirit. Van Helsing used the reprieve to dash toward Santa. "Sir," he said, voice strained, "the workshop is under full assault. The barrier has been compromised. Krampus is inside. And so are many other threats. I'm holding them off, but..." Santa nodded gravely. "This is more than I can handle alone, but we must keep Christmas alive. Van Helsing, guard the perimeter while I attempt to restore the central defenses. We must trust Pops, Olive, and the others inside to subdue Krampus. If we fail, countless children will face a joyless Christmas." Van Helsing gave a tense nod. "Understood. I won't fail you." He whirled, crossbow ready, diving back into the thick of it. Inside the stable, Olive had managed to finish applying the last of the conifer cure-all. Blitzer's breathing was steady now. The bruise was all but gone. Olive beamed, tears of relief welling in her eyes. "You're going to be okay," she whispered to the reindeer. He licked her hand, grateful. Pop struggled to his feet, leaning on a broken post for support. Hagatha hovered near the stable entrance, her anger radiating off her in waves. She locked eyes with Olive, then flicked her gaze back to Pop's. There was a heated desperation in that look. She was going to push her power to the limit. "Enough of these petty spells," Hagatha hissed. "You want to fight? Let's end this, once and for all." Dark avalanche. She flew outside into the open air, staff raised to the swirling clouds, summoning a colossal wave of black, glittering snow. It loomed in the sky like a demonic blizzard, ready to crash down on the entire stable and everyone inside. Pops cursed under his breath. "We need to get Blitzer out of here." He glanced at Olive, who was already guiding the reindeer away. Santa's newly repaired stable walls creaked ominously under the pressure of Hagatha's conjured avalanche. "This is insane," Olive shouted, pulling Pops aside. "I'll get Blitzer to safety. You have to stop her." Pop swallowed hard, fear twisting his gut. But he clenched his fists. "I won't let her destroy our Christmas. Or you." With that, he stepped outside, boots crunching on the snow, standing below Hagatha's swirling mass of dark frost. The wiffle hen hopped from the stable beams to his shoulder, letting out an encouraging coo. Hagatha locked eyes with him, her expression maniacal. "Still so heroic, Pops. Come, let's see whose magic is stronger." "Bring it on," he roared, adrenaline pounding in his veins. She thrust her staff downward, unleashing the avalanche. Permafrost onslaught. A tidal wave of black snow thundered forward. Pops inhaled, focusing on the chaotic magic churning in the wiffle hen's feathers. He felt a stirring of energy in his own fists, a swirl of molten heat combined with shimmering starlight. He had no idea what kind of random magic he'd get, but he trusted in the wiffle hen. He roared, "Solar Snowbreaker Blast." His fists erupted with swirling gold and white flames, which clashed against the avalanche. Snow hissed and evaporated, sending up massive clouds of steam. For a few seconds, the entire battlefield was engulfed in a dense fog, the leftover magic from Hagatha's avalanche clashing with the solar flames. Hagatha tried to maintain her spell, but the heat was too intense. Part of the avalanche melted, part refroze, and part crashed harmlessly down on the outskirts, burying only empty snowdrifts. Panting, Pop stared into the fog. He sensed Hagatha behind it, her rage undiminished. Meanwhile, deeper toward the workshop courtyard, Feathermaster soared above the swirling clouds of steam, searching for Santa. The possessed glimmer in Feathermaster's eyes hinted at how close he thought he was to claiming Santa's eye. He chuckled to himself. "If I can't find Santa, I'll flush him out." Cultists. Ascendancy ritual. Below, his hooded followers stabbed crystal rods into the snow. A menacing hum began to build. Crimson arcs of energy leapt from rod to rod, forming a pentagram around the workshop courtyard. Feathermaster hovered in the center, arms spread wide, calling out, "Feathered Apocalypse." A swirling vortex of magical feathers, each pulsating with stolen power from birds around the world, formed overhead. The air crackled, and the elves in the courtyard looked up in horror. Santa, staff in hand, gritted his teeth. If that vortex was unleashed, it could shred the workshop to pieces. Before Feathermaster could bring it down, a furious bark and a flash of silver soared toward him. Van Helsing had fired a tethered grappling arrow from his crossbow, hooking onto Feathermaster's boot. "You're not destroying this workshop on my watch." The monster hunter roared. He yanked hard, pulling Feathermaster off balance midair. Feathermaster snarled, losing control of his swirling vortex, which began to flicker. "How dare you," he spat. "My ascension is at hand." Van Helsing rocketed upward as the tether reeled him in. "Heavenly cross slash," he shouted, twisting midair to draw a gleaming sword from his coat. He slashed at Feathermaster, the blade erupting in a cross-shaped beam of holy light. Feathermaster barely managed to shield his face with one arm, the blow slicing off several of the prized feathers from his headdress. Infuriated, he retaliated with a punch wreathed in shimmering feathers. Divine Claw. The blow landed on Van Helsing's chest, flinging him downward. He crashed onto the roof of the workshop, tiles shattering on impact. A cry of anguish escaped Van Helsing as he struggled to stand, breathing heavily. Feathermaster descended, preparing to strike again. But just then, the workshop's doors burst open. Santa marched out, staff in hand, flanked by a small contingent of elves who bravely held candy cane swords. "You will not harm my domain," Santa said, voice solemn. He pointed his staff at Feathermaster. "Christmas miracles, evergreen wrath." A shower of magical pine needles shot forth, each glowing with green luminescence. Feathermaster's eyes widened, and he rapidly swiped his arms, summoning a cyclone of feathers to shield him. Needles struck Feather, scattering harmlessly, but the sheer volume forced him to focus entirely on defense. Van Helsing took the opening. He wiped blood from his lip, then stood tall. "You're cornered now," he muttered, brandishing his sword. Across the courtyard, the last remnants of Hagatha's avalanche had dissipated, the steam clearing to reveal Pop standing defiant. Hagatha floated above him, frustration seething in her eyes, her conjured staff crackling with leftover dark energy. She was about to call forth another monstrous wave when a painful memory tugged at her mind. Centuries of lonely existence, the last witch on Earth, always forced to scrape and fight for survival. She didn't want to merely exist anymore, she wanted love, specifically from Pops, though she never considered that love couldn't be forced or stolen. "Why?" Pops shouted up at her, fists still glowing faintly. "Why ruin Christmas? Why go to these extremes?" Hagatha scoffed, though her voice wavered. "Because if I can control Santa's elves, I can build anything. And that includes something powerful enough to remove Olive from your life forever." She paused, eyes wild. "But you wouldn't understand, no one does. I've spent centuries alone." Pops frowned, his anger mixing with a hint of pity. "Hagatha, this isn't the way." He advanced a step. She shook her head, tears glistening for just an instant before her fury flared anew. "Enough talk. Let's settle it. Right here, right now." Pops braced himself. He and Hagatha both charged magical energies. In a swirl of black and gold, they roared out. Dead of winter, seaside solstice. They collided in a flash of brilliant light, creating a shockwave that spread out in concentric rings. Snow blew outward in all directions, revealing the horizon of the North Pole's tundra, and beyond it, the faint glow of the aurora borealis flickering across the sky. Inside the stable, Olive shielded Blitzer from the worst of the shockwave. She looked out, heart pounding with worry for Pops. The recoil of magical energy was fierce. She saw his silhouette braced against Hagatha's swirling aura. The entire North Pole felt like it might tear apart. And yet, an unexpected hush fell over the battlefield. Pop's blow cracked through Hagatha's protective spells, sending her staff flying from her hand. She hurtled backward, crashing into a massive snowbank. Panting, Pops readied himself for a follow-up strike, but paused when he realized she wasn't moving. Gasping for breath, he approached the fallen witch. She sat up, wincing, her hair askew and a bruise forming on her cheek. For a moment, something in her eyes looked vulnerable. She reached a trembling hand forward, as though trying to touch his cheek. "Pops," she whispered, tears slipping down her face. "Why? Why can't you love me?" Pop's heart twisted. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "My heart belongs to Olive. And it always will. We might not see eye to eye, but I don't want to kill you." He extended a hand to help her up. Hagatha stared at him, wavering. Centuries of hatred and solitude warred with the flickering ember of longing for acceptance. She let out a strangled sob, clutched his outstretched hand, and, surprisingly, did not conjure a new attack. She rose unsteadily, tears marking the lines in her ancient face. Some distance away, the conflict between Feathermaster, Santa, and Van Helsing raged on. Feathermaster was losing feathers from his headdress each time Santa or Van Helsing landed a blow. Still, his mania was unbroken. He soared higher, eyes blazing with ambition. "If I cannot have Santa's eye," he growled, "I'll take the Whiffle hen's feathers once and for all and become a god anyway." Spotting Pops and the bright green bird perched on his shoulder, Feathermaster dove downward in an all-out blitz. Almighty dive bomb. Pops barely had a second to react. "Look out," he shouted, shoving Hagatha aside. Feathermaster's strike was aimed for the Whiffle hen. A monstrous wave of swirling feathers crashed toward them. In that desperate moment, Pops roared, "Whiffle hen, help me." The Whiffle hen clucked, eyes flashing with magical sparkles. A wave of shimmering power enveloped Pop's fists once more. He leapt forward, meeting Feathermaster head-on. Their powers collided in a deafening clash. Feathermaster unleashed a torrent of multicolored feathers like shrapnel, slicing into Pop's coat and drawing thin lines of blood. Pops, ignoring the pain, thrust his fists forward in a final, explosive strike. Avian Starbreaker. Golden brilliance erupted from Pops, shaped by the Whiffle hen's random enchantment, creating an enormous, shimmering bird made of light that rammed into Feathermaster. The tyrant was thrown back with bone-rattling force, smashing into the frosty ground so hard that ice cracked beneath him. His cultists scrambled to his side, horrified and confused by the sudden shift in power. Pops landed heavily, knees buckling from exhaustion. The wiffle hen fluttered to the ground, letting out worried chirps. He swayed, stunned by the magnitude of the magic he'd just wielded. Olive rushed out, pressing her hands against his chest. "Pops," she gasped, tears welling in her eyes. He looked at her, battered but grinning. "I told you I'd protect you," he murmured. Nearby, Feathermaster groaned, battered and beaten. The cultists rushed to gather him, many of them removing their own lesser headdresses to try and salvage some of the scattered magical feathers. But the grand headdress itself lay broken beside him, snapped in two from the final blow. Whatever false divinity he had pursued was now just glittering bits of plumage on the snow. Santa approached the scene with Van Helsing limping beside him. Elves circled the area, carefully rounding up any remaining mischief makers. Krampus, who had been hammered by Pops earlier, retreated into the surrounding tundra, howling all the way. The monstrous conjurations from Hagatha had faded with her moment of emotional collapse, and the barriers had been partially restored by Santa's magic. Though battered and bruised, the North Pole still stood. Christmas had a fighting chance. Santa surveyed his workshop and stable. Many parts had been damaged by the battles, but the crucial elements for delivering gifts seemed intact. The sleigh had survived, and so had the reindeer. Olive's treatment of Blitzer had been successful, though the reindeer was still recovering. Van Helsing made to step toward Hagatha, crossbow in hand. "Witch, you realize I have a vow too." Hagatha gazed at him, shoulders slumped, but with no more hatred in her eyes. She was simply tired. "I'm done, Van Helsing," she said quietly. "You've already taken everything else from me. Perhaps there's another way. Or perhaps I'll just fade away in peace." The professor paused, uncertain. His family's legacy told him to finish her off, but the spirit of Christmas, a day meant for second chances, held him back. He lowered his crossbow. "Then leave," he muttered. "Don't let me see you harming others again." She nodded slowly, hugging her arms around herself. With a final, forlorn glance at Pops, she drifted into the snow, presumably to find a quiet place to nurse her injuries, physical and otherwise. Santa turned to Van Helsing, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did well tonight. Sometimes giving mercy is just as important as bravely fighting." Van Helsing exhaled a breath he'd been holding. He nodded, though the weight of centuries of tradition still bore upon him. "I only hope letting her go doesn't cost us later," he muttered. But deep down, a small part of him felt relief that the endless cycle of violence might, just might, find another path. Feathermaster's cultists carried him away, stumbling off into the silent darkness of the Arctic, powerless to continue their assault. Whether he would nurse his wounds and return was an open question, but for now, he was defeated. In the aftermath, Santa's elves hurried to repair what they could under the old man's watchful direction. The stable was fortified, the sleigh rebalanced, and the reindeer given the final checkup from Olive. Blitzer, though still slightly sore, was declared fit to fly. Pops, leaning against a wooden post, gently rubbed the wiffle hen's feathers in gratitude. "Thanks, little buddy," he said quietly, the bird cooing. Olive approached him, wearing a tired but proud smile. "You were incredible," she told him, one hand on his arm. "You saved Christmas. You saved everyone." He blushed, smiling in spite of his injuries. "We all did our part. I just punched stuff." A wave of self-doubt flickered across his features, as it always did when he thought about asking for her hand in marriage. There was something I wanted to get for you." He trailed off, feeling foolish for thinking about gifts in the aftermath of that cataclysmic fight. But Santa, overhearing, chuckled warmly. Ho, I think we can arrange something," he said. He gestured for Pops and Olive to follow him deeper into the workshop, down a corridor that the elves had mostly cleared of debris. They arrived at a small, hidden alcove where Santa stored special handmade gifts not meant for mass distribution but for those who had done extraordinary deeds. Elves scurried around them, reorganizing piles of half-finished toys and carefully sealed boxes. Santa picked up a small, beautifully wrapped box with a bright silver ribbon. "Consider this a token of my appreciation," Santa said, pressing it into Pop's hand. "Open it somewhere special." Pop swallowed hard, bowing his head in, "Thanks." He could feel the weight of the object inside, sensed the care that had gone into it. Olive watched him, intrigue dancing in her eyes. That night, after the final repairs were done and Santa was preparing the sleigh for flight, the clock struck midnight. The holiday air felt electric, brimming with the promise of miracles. As Santa called out to his reindeer, readying for the journey that would span the entire world, Pops took Olive's hand and led her to a quiet corner behind the workshop. The snow glistened under the North Star. Far off, the aurora shimmered in ribbons of green and purple. A hush had fallen now that the battles were over. Pops cleared his throat, heart pounding. He handed Olive the neatly wrapped gift from Santa. "It's for you," he said softly. Santa said, "Well, it's something special." Olive gave him a warm smile. "You're the one who's special," she murmured. But she opened the gift, gently removing the silver ribbon and lifting the box's lid. Inside was a small golden locket, exquisitely crafted in the shape of two hearts overlapping. The faintest Christmas magic made the metal glow. She gasped, cupping it in her hand. "Oh, Pops," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "It's beautiful." He took a shaky breath.
I know I'm still just a brawler from the Sailing Adventurers Guild.
And I know I'm always rushing into fights. Sometimes I think I'm not good enough for you. But I love you, Olive. And I want to be by your side, forever." She smiled through her tears, stepping closer. "Why would you ever think you're not good enough? You're exactly what I need. You're brave, reckless, strong, but you have the biggest heart of anyone I've met." They were close now, inches apart. Pop swallowed the lump in his throat. "Will you?" His voice cracked. "Will you marry me?" Olive answered by throwing her arms around him. "Yes," she said, voice trembling with emotion. 1,000 times yes. The wiffle hen, perched on a nearby shelf, let out a triumphant coo. Soft magical sparks danced around them, as though the very air was blessing their union. The cold seemed to fade. Pops closed his eyes, relief and joy washing over him like a tidal wave. It was as if, for a moment, time stood still. High overhead, Santa's sleigh soared off into the night, the cheerful jingle of bells echoing behind. Professor Van Helsing, standing by a battered section of the workshop's fence, lowered his crossbow and watched them with a distant, contemplative look. In the corners of his mind, he realized he'd let the last witch go. He wondered if he'd done the right thing. But maybe, in the spirit of Christmas, second chances were possible. He exhaled, turning away and resuming his guard. Someday, he and Hagatha might cross paths again, but for now, the night ended in peace. At least for Christmas Eve. As for Hagatha, she trudged alone through the darkened snowfields, the midnight sky reflecting her tears. She nursed her wounds, yet there was a sliver of warmth, the memory of Pop's compassion. She had tried to kill Olive but failed. She had tried to claim a love that wasn't hers. And now, for the first time in centuries, she didn't feel the iron weight of vengeance pushing her forward, only confusion, heartbreak, and a peculiar sense of relief. Maybe there was a different path for her, though she couldn't see it yet. Feathermaster, carried by his shaken cultists, vanished into the icy horizon, stripped of much of his feathery power, his illusions of divinity momentarily shattered. But a single burning desire remained in his heart, he still believed in his rightful claim to rule. Perhaps he would scheme anew to achieve his twisted ends. But the North Pole would remain safe, for now. In the quiet dawn that followed, the elves finished cleaning up the debris. The barrier was restored fully, making sure no more intruders would spoil the holiday. And soon enough, the first light of Christmas morning broke across the horizon. Children around the world awoke to find gifts under their trees, stockings filled, and the joy that only Christmas can bring. None of them knew how close the holiday had come to unraveling. Back at the North Pole, Pops and Olive stood together, the golden locket gleaming at her neck. Despite their fatigue, they both felt a serene warmth. The battles had been intense, the lines between friend and foe blurred by ambition and obsession, but in the end, Christmas spirit had prevailed. Pops reflected on what had changed inside him. He no longer felt unworthy. He had proven to himself that his heart was strong, guided by love and the desire to protect those who mattered. He smiled at Olive, who glowed with a renewed purpose. She had learned that even in the face of danger and competition, compassion was the greatest weapon, one that could soothe the savage beasts of the world. Meanwhile, Professor Van Helsing stood near the workshop's edge, still watchful. He observed the couple, an odd pang of envy stirring in him. He often felt solitary, guided only by the vow of monster hunters. But seeing Pops and Olive together, and witnessing the faint shimmer of redemption in Hagatha's eyes before she left, gave him a spark of a new idea. Perhaps there was more to life than an endless cycle of hunts. A few elves approached him, offering hot cocoa. He gave a small, polite nod and accepted. He'd stay for a bit longer, ensuring no more threats emerged, but he suspected that this Christmas day would be peaceful. After all, Santa was already circling the globe, delivering miracles. And as far as Van Helsing was concerned, witnessing genuine love might be the most disarming force of all. And so it was that Christmas remained unbroken. The battered yet resilient North Pole might have been a battlefield on Christmas Eve, but dawn brought fresh hope. Every participant in that grand melee had walked away changed. Some, like Hagatha, were forced to confront their loneliness and obsession. Others, like Feathermaster, faced the collapse of their godlike ambitions. Professor Van Helsing saw the possibility of an alternative path to his mission. And Pops and Olive found a deeper bond, sealed in the moment he proposed and she accepted. As the final hours of darkness faded, the wind carried away the echoes of fierce battles and monstrous roars. In their place, a chorus of bells chimed from within the workshop, accompanied by the joyful hum of elves finishing their busiest night of the year. The whiffle hen crowed jubilantly, perched once again on Pop's shoulder, feathers fluttering with contentment. Underneath the swirling curtains of the aurora borealis, Christmas morning had come. Though it had been a night of chaos and conflict, love and pride had driven them all to do the impossible. Hagatha had tried to harness the elves, Van Helsing had tried to protect the workshop, Feathermaster had tried to steal Santa's eye for power. Yet somehow, out of that swirling tempest of ambition, Christmas had been preserved. No one wanted to be the one who ruined the magic. Pops and Olive lingered beside the stables, where Blitzer nuzzled Olive in gratitude. With the conifer cure-all fully taking effect, Blitzer seemed to be back to his old self. The other reindeer stomped their hooves, impatient to fly again next year. In time, they would all join Santa for a triumphant feast, their mission to deliver joy having succeeded against all odds. But for now, the North Pole breathed a sigh of relief. Christmas had survived. The night's battles had ended in a tenuous peace, each side returning to lick their wounds or celebrate their victory in the ways they saw fit. Pop slipped his arm around Olive's waist and kissed her cheek. She leaned into him, admiring the dazzling sunrise. In a whisper, she said, "This is the best Christmas I've ever had." Pops nodded, his heart swollen with contentment. "Me too," he said, voice thick with emotion. He looked up at the vast sky, already imagining future journeys they would share. "We made it through this one together," he murmured. "And next time, we'll face whatever comes. As husband and wife." And with that, a new chapter in their story began. They'd gained not only new scars and stories to tell but a deeper understanding of what bound them all together, the fight to protect what they loved most. The spirit of Christmas, with all its wonder and unity, had reminded them that even in a world of witches, monster hunters, tyrant cult leaders, and living legends, there was something deeply human, and powerfully magical, about compassion, forgiveness, and hope. High above, Santa stood on the roof of his workshop in the first rays of dawn, eyes gleaming with ancient wisdom. He had seen conflict many times before, but never had the stakes for Christmas been quite so high. And never had he been so proud to call upon such brave souls, imperfect though they might be, to defend the holiday. He glanced down with his magic sight, glimpsing Pops and Olive in their tender embrace, glimpsing Van Helsing finally at rest, glimpsing Hagatha trudging through the snow with something new stirring in her ancient heart, and glimpsing Feathermaster carried off by his followers, broken but perhaps not irredeemable. A jolly laugh rumbled from Santa's lips. "Merry Christmas to all," he said softly, "and to all a good night." And though the night had indeed been tumultuous, what remained was the profound magic that always resides in the hearts of those who believe, in love, in second chances, and in the power of unity when everything else seems lost. Christmas was safe. And for one fleeting, precious day, the battles and rivalries paused beneath the gentle snowfall at the top of the world. Everyone, in their own way, got just enough of what they truly needed to remember the simple truth of the holidays, that in spite of our differences, we can find compassion, if only we dare to look for it in ourselves and in each other.